All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. Thanks for tuning in. We're doing our 249th Bible Decode today. This here is an educational channel, and we try to focus on very impactful theories and discoveries, magnum opuses, and tour de forces emanating from obscure sources that you probably haven't heard of, but if you did, they'd make a big impact on your life. And we're focusing on the New Testament so much because of the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. Many authors have gone this route, and it has great explanatory power, in my opinion. And that is that the New Testament in its entirety was written by the Romans. The Caesars of the Flavian dynasty in particular, that is Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, that ruled the Roman Empire from 69 until 96 AD. Vespasian and Titus had just gotten done fighting a war against the Jews, and then they became emperors. And they were both wounded in that war, and the motive for them, as well as the rest of the Roman royals, was to mellow out the Jews, to tame the Jews, to pacify the Jews, to get them to obey with Roman, customs, and to prune the Jews, to domesticate the Jews. And kind of as a sidelight, Titus also wanted to get the Jews to worship him, mistakenly. And so what they did is they wrote the Gospels and backdated the story by 40 plus years. And then they also wrote a history of this war against the Jews called War of the Jews, or Jewish War, 7 volumes under the name of Josephus or Josephus. And if you take a look at Jewish War, you will see that there are many legion parallels between Jewish War and the New Testament. Michael Menescott dug into the book of Luke and found over 250 parallels just in the book of Luke between Luke and the War of the Jews. And then he also organized those parallels on a chart using the book of Luke on the vertical axis, War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. And by doing that, he formed 5 near-perfect letters of the same size in Latin, which is the emerging language of the Romans. Most Romans were speaking in Greek, and the royals were also speaking in Latin, writing in Latin. And those letters are A, P, T, V, S. Titus and Vespasian. And then the A and the P, not so sure about. But basically what it means is that the Romans not only wrote the book of Luke, but they signed their name to it. And Joseph Atwill also has noticed that the ministry of Jesus in Judea is a copy of the military campaign of Titus in Judea. With over 40 data points, 40 separate events, every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes. in the same order. They experience parallel events at each location that are spaced out by 40 years in time. Also, many of the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament are fulfilled in the pages of the War of the Jews, in particular by Titus, and especially Jesus' prophecy that the city of Jerusalem would be torn limb from limb, so to speak, brick by brick or stone by stone, and that would be the marking of the second coming of Jesus. And so that makes Titus, who destroyed Jerusalem brick by brick or whatever, he is the second coming of Jesus. So Titus is the fulfillment of all of the Jewish lineage, all the way down from Adam to Seth, eventually to Enoch and Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and David and Jesus, and then Titus. So in that same way, much of the codes, the parallels between the two works tend to mock the Jews, to ridicule them, demean them, humiliate them, and anybody else who believes in the fiction that they had just written. The Romans were masters of psychological operations. They had created a number of other religions here in the first century for the purposes of psychological warfare, including another, really, the rabbinical Judaism, was targeted at kind of a different group of Jews, the Pharisees, as opposed to more zealot people for the Jesus movement. But the script was very, very similar. Okay, now what we're doing today, again, I think this is like the 54th episode of going through this book by Rosemary Sheldon and Thais Voskelin, and it's called Operation Messiah. And let me just say that if you want more evidence of the, all the codes and stuff like that for Christianity and War of the Jews, that's all in all these previous videos. I go over the 250 parallels one at a time in painstaking detail. And I also go over the evidence a little bit more than I'm doing right here. Basically, the Romans were trying to mellow out the Jews by taking advantage of the fact that the Jews were waiting for a military Messiah, a Messiah that would come and help them overthrow the Jews. And so instead, the Romans proposed a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace. And so at the same time that he was totally deferential to Rome throughout the Gospels, he's also injurious to the Jewish traditions when he overturns the tables of the money changers at the temple and cusses out the Jews who were selling small animals for the sacrifice at the temple. So this is a Jesus, a Jewish savior who is, pro-Roman and anti-Jew. And then when you read the Pauline epistles, you discover that Paul is even more pro-Roman and anti-Jew, to the point where Thies Voskuilen and Rosemary Sheldon, in their book Operation Messiah, actually hypothesize that Paul was an intelligence agent of the Romans. So that Paul was a spy, and that his conversion on the road to Damascus was fake, and for the purposes of making him seem not like he's a persecutor, but like he has been converted so that he can infiltrate the Jesus movement of the Nazarenes, which included James, Jesus' brother, along with Peter. And that they were being targeted. And, they go through the evidence that, Paul, every place that Paul goes, basically there's a false flag operation, and the Jews are trying to kill Paul. Some kind of chaos ensues, and the Romans have to rescue Paul. And it just seems like the Romans treat him in an anomalous manner for a prisoner. They actually, at one point in the book of Acts, allow Paul to give a speech to his followers as a prisoner. The guards stop in their tracks and let Paul give a speech. Okay, so anyway, we are in the conclusion of this book, and we're about to start a section that's called hostility. Paul claimed that his interpretations were not just his own invention, but they had come to him by personal inspiration. He actually claimed to have communicated with the resurrected Jesus through visions, and he asserted that his relationship was actually superior to knowing the actual Jesus during his lifetime. Did the Jerusalem Nazarenes accept this fact, or did they think he was a dangerous schismatic? Was Paul's spinning complicated theories about the place of Jesus in the scheme of things? Let me read that sentence again, sorry. Was Paul spinning complicated theories about the place of Jesus in the scheme of things, and was he getting everything wrong? The fact that Paul was arrested and tried in Jerusalem does not speak well for his acceptance there by the Nazarenes or the Pharisees. Many believe Paul was not a Pharisee, even though he portrayed himself as one, because he did not live as one. Acts makes it appear that there was some friction between Paul and the Nazarene leaders in Jerusalem, but later this friction was resolved, and they all became the best of friends with common aims and purposes. From certain of Paul's letters, particularly Galatians and Corinthians, however, it seems that the friction was more serious than is portrayed by Acts, which appears to be partly a propaganda exercise intended to show unity in the early church. The political differences between Paul and Jesus should not be minimized. The historical figure of Jesus was one of importance to the Jews, a Messiah figure who may have raised the banner of revolt against Rome. Please cite me some examples of that, because I don't see any in my reading of the Gospels. And although this claim cannot be definitely proved or disproved, in the end, it does not matter, because Christianity was not based on the historical Jesus who lived and died in Palestine. Rather, it was based on the mythical Jesus who was resurrected like the gods of the mystery cults and brought salvation through his resurrection. This Hellenistic myth removed Jesus from his historical connections, whatever they may have been, and turned him into a totally mythical figure of greater spiritual importance. The mythological scheme of Paul was far more universal than that of the Jerusalem Nazarenes, and indeed even that of Jesus. And this interpretation was far more convenient for the Romans. The implications of Paul's teaching were not lost on the Nazarenes. For the politically and religiously alert members of the Nazarenes, the world was a great spider web with its center at Jerusalem. The hyper-attentive members of the Nazarene movement were aware of motion at any place on the web. And intelligence was transmitted back to them about Rome and their enemies. Even if we do not have compelling evidence of Paul's ties to the Romans, the Nazarenes may have known or guessed that Paul was in an excellent position to pick up information about their members and what they were doing. This information would have been very valuable to both the Romans and their Herodian clients. Knowing such things is what intelligence agents get paid to do. Even in his later career, what do we see Paul engaged in? He was constantly sending and receiving messages and instructing, it's super blurry, and instructing emissaries even when he was in Roman custody. Judging by Acts, he had a good communication system set up with provincial authorities by which he was warned before entering a theater. Communication and the distribution of intelligence were his métier. Jerusalem was a hotbed of nationalistic and messianic activity. There were assassins, revolutionaries, bandits, Jewish quislings, Roman occupiers, and they all had their own intelligence networks. The question is, to which one was Paul connected? Okay, this section is called Paul and the Jews. We, along with others, have argued that Jesus was not in conflict with Judaism and that his death took place for political reasons. This fact was later camouflaged as religious dissent by the Christian church in its anxiety to cover up the fact that Jesus was executed as a rebel fighting against Rome. So there's certainly no evidence in the Gospels for any of that. Now, that doesn't mean anything, but I think it's just more explanatory to declare all of it fiction, not just Paul and not just the Christian religion, which they say is a mythical Jesus, is following a mythical Jesus, one that is resurrected in exactly the same manner as many of the pagan mystery cults at that time. But even just the life of Jesus is also a myth and a fiction. The Romans wrote the whole thing because otherwise they're contorting themselves to conclude that Jesus was a political freedom fighter against Rome, where there isn't any evidence for that. The only evidence for that is really that they say he was executed by the Romans after, the Jews basically begged them to do it, and that he was a threat to the Romans, not because he was against the Romans, but because he created chaos. When he goes to the temple and overturns the tables, he's acting against the Jews, but it's still somewhat of a threat to the Romans because it's a chaotic event happening within their jurisdiction. But this, to me, this is a very clear contortion, to try to kind of speculate about this history of what really happened with Jesus, how, they're basically assuming that this event actually occurred when there isn't any evidence for that. All of the evidence that corroborates the existence of Jesus is Roman in origin, Roman royalty in origin, such as Josephus and Tacitus and Trajan and Suetonius and Pliny the Younger. They are all working for the Flavians pretty much. Trajan, even before he became emperor, according to Josephus at least, Trajan was one of the military commanders of the 10th Legion under Vespasian. Okay. So where would this position lead us with regard to Paul? Here are the options. Firstly, that both Jesus and Paul were revolutionaries. Here are the options. Firstly, that both Jesus and Paul were revolutionaries. Secondly, that both Jesus and Paul were preaching an otherworldly and non-political eschatology. Or thirdly, that Jesus was a revolutionary, but only Paul preached the otherworldly and non-political eschatology. We have argued for the third. Yeah, right. And that is a stretch. And it is this interpretation that has led many people to call Paul the founder of Christianity. One scholar wrote, without Paul, Christianity would not have become a world religion with a distinctive theology and a highly developed ecclesiastical organization. When one falls on the spectrum of opinion is influenced by what kind of Jews one thinks Jesus and Paul were. Much recent scholarship has focused on the Jewishness of them both. Needless to say, there is no scholarly consensus. Opinions range from Boyarin, who sees Paul as a Jewish cultural critic, to older liberal Jewish authors like Kaufman Kohler, the distinguished Talmudic scholar and editor of the Jewish Encyclopedia, who in 1902 wrote that nothing in Paul's writings showed that he had any acquaintance with rabbinical learning. Well, I guess, but I mean, I know there was rabbinical learning before there was rabbinical Judaism. But they both were kind of burgeoning at this point in time. And, it's not like the rabbinical tradition goes back much further than where we are here with Paul. So, there might, the fact that he didn't have any acquaintance with it probably means he's not a Pharisee, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he's not a real Jew or anything. I'm not sure if that's what the point is that they're making, but I'm a little bit skeptical. Other modern Jewish scholars have agreed with this position. This school of thought believes it is Paul who was responsible for the break with Judaism that produced the Christian church and its motivation to feign a split between Jesus and Judaism. But there are many acts that Jesus undertakes in the Gospels that shows he is willing to break with Judaism as well. When asked about the 10 Commandments, Jesus lists 5. And he lists the 5 that are more secular in nature, less godlike in nature. He also, overturns the tables of the money changers, and he, is going after the Jewish rituals and traditions. He's telling his disciples to abandon their families. So this doesn't really ring true for me. Okay, why were the Nazarenes seen as politically dangerous? Because they were a large movement in Jerusalem that recruited among the disaffected Jewish masses, and they numbered in the thousands. These were ardent Jews who believed that their religion and politics were inseparable, and that the Roman Empire was wicked and idolatrous. To bring about the downfall of that empire would be a work pleasing to God, and the coming of the Messiah represented proof that God was on their side. Within the Nazarene movement, Jesus could not be acknowledged as the Messiah without the recognition of the spiritual as well as the political implications of his office. So far as the active Messianist conspirators were concerned, there was an old, established, and recognized system which lent itself admirably to their purpose. They sought to create cells in cities with large Jewish populations, which could be the means of spreading their message, considered subversive propaganda by the Romans, and organizing support from the diaspora should they revolt against the Romans. We may refer to this system as the apostolic system. The Jewish apostles, or envoys in the original sense of the term, were the agents sent out from Jerusalem to the Jewish communities abroad to collect the half-shekel temple tax. The system itself was under Roman protection, and the Romans themselves, by their road construction and posts, had greatly facilitated the journeys of the apostles, a fact which must have been appreciated as divine justice by the Messianists intent on Rome's overthrow. Such apostles would also carry official letters about calendar arrangements for the observation of Jewish holy days, as well as much welcome news about affairs in Palestine. It would have been very difficult for the Romans to tell if any of the accredited apostles were part of the conspiracy. Many itinerant Jewish teachers also utilized these avenues of communication, which provided the opportunity for the journeys of Paul, posing as a representative of the Nazarenes. It is likely enough, therefore, that the Messianist agents would not only seek to establish cells of revolt wherever they went, but they would also collect funds from the diaspora for the purchase of weapons for the movement. Jewish artisans traveling from city to city in the diaspora could serve the same ends. When Paul was mistaken for one of these agents, he was called a plague carrier, a fomenter of revolt among all the Jews of the empire. Claudius found it necessary to warn the Jews of Alexandria not to entertain Jewish itinerants from Syria and Upper Egypt if they did not wish to be punished. He was not being overtly cautious. Overly cautious. During Trajan's second Parthian campaign, a Jewish revolt sprung up simultaneously in Egypt, Cyrene, Cyprus, and Mesopotamia. Jews traveled to synagogues collecting arms and equipment in anticipation of the Bar Kokhba revolt. When Paul passed himself off as a Nazarene, it is no wonder that he was mistaken for a zealot agent and rejected by peace-loving Jews in the provinces. I'm not a big fan of that paragraph either. That I mean, we're going all over the map here, from Trajan's Second Parthian campaign all the way up to Bar Kokhba revolt, and Claudius, Emperor Claudius. That's 75 years earlier. They found it necessary to warn the Jews of Alexandria. So, I mean, none of that necessarily applies to Paul. Okay. The major problem with tracking Paul's activities among the Nazarenes is that we have no idea what was going on inside the Nazarene community at that time. We do not know their internal controversies, their membership, what disagreements emerged between individuals, and what information about Jesus had been altered or suppressed. And Paul's activities, if clandestine, would have been suppressed even more. We can say for certain that the Gnostic themes in Paul's new religion were something totally different from what the Nazarenes were saying about Jesus. The question of whether Christianity in the form given to it by Paul is really continuous with Judaism or whether it is a new doctrine having no roots in Judaism is too large to be adequately discussed here. The question has been the subject of countless books and articles. Suffice it to say that it has been noticed that Pauline Christianity seems to draw from pagan myths of dying and resurrected gods and Gnostic myths of heaven-descended redeemers. Did Paul truly stand in the Jewish tradition, or was he a Hellenistic religious type, seeking to give a coloring of Judaism to a salvation cult that was really opposed to everything that Judaism stood for? Some believe Paul combined Stoicism, Gnosticism, Judaism, and nascent Christian theology and transformed all of them into a mix of his own. We find it valid to ask whether this mixture also served a political purpose. We believe one of Paul's driving forces may have been to erase anti-Roman attitudes that probably existed inside the Messianist movement, and that echoes of this mission have survived in Acts. Okay, that's the end of that section, and we're going to stop there. The next section starts up with Paul and the rulers of the age. We might read this last paragraph again when we come back tomorrow, because what they're saying, they kind of blame this on Paul when it's much more explanatory to blame it on the Roman Caesars. That he's combining Stoicism, Gnosticism, Judaism, and nascent Christian theology. That's what the Romans were doing. But they just put it all on Paul. Okay, thanks for tuning in.